and welcome to the Halifax Central Library, which sits on the unceded traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq, the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq Nation. I'm Chris Stover, the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, or CCEPA, as we've become known. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. This is a great showing, and to all of you in our live stream audience. CCEPA is a not-for-profit organization co-founded by the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University. CCEPA believes strongly that how we live matters. It's an organization tasked with creating the space for provocative and sometimes difficult conversations about the ethical challenges of everyday life. Our objective is to look at the rightness or the wrongness of issues, to find out where the needle is on our moral compass, and to ask why it's there, question whether it needs to move, and if so, how we would go about doing that. CCEPA won't ever tell you what's right or what's wrong. As a non-advocacy organization, we're merely here to serve up the contemplation. The 7 Deadly Sins is a series which explores the personal and collective consequences of our thoughts and actions as we continue to grapple with these age-old temptations like lust and greed, gluttony, envy, pride, wrath, and sloth. Tonight we're turning our minds to gluttony, and we'll ask questions like, what is our historical understanding of gluttony through an ethical, biblical, sociological, or policy lens? What is the root of excessive consumption? What's the relationship between gluttony and obesity? And what does a balance of personal and external responsibility for our consumption look like? How much of what we consume is driven by deliberate corporate initiatives? And why do we sometimes negatively judge fat people and we don't similarly judge the skinny glutton? Our thanks goes out tonight to the Halifax Central Library for use of this beautiful space, and to the Segelberg Trust, whose generous sponsorship allows us to live stream and record this broadcast. And I'm now very excited to introduce our moderator for this evening. Mary Link has more than 30 years of experience in the media, mainly in radio. She began her career as a newspaper journalist. She helped break the story of rampant child abuse within Newfoundland's Mount Cashel Orphanage. She's currently the producer of CBC radio program Ideas, based here in Halifax. Prior to that, she was the CBC network producer for the Atlantic region for 10 years, producing shows like The Current, Sunday Edition, Tapestry, As It Happens, as well as Ideas. She's won almost too many awards to mention, so I'll mention a couple of them. A couple of Gemini nominations, World Gold Medals at New York festivals, a National RTNDA Peterzowski Award, and an Excellence in Health Reporting Award by the Canadian Medical Association. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mary Link.
I don't know why I was chosen for tonight, but I suppose amongst all the sins, gluttony is the one that my mother probably won't mind as much. We're going to do we have these very talented and smart people here. I'm just merely the stick handler. We're going to have questions from the audience online and here tonight. So we'll take, in between each main question, we're going to ask one question one time from any one of you, brave souls, and Lydia over here will come to you with her microphone, and then we'll ask for an online question. I just want to let them know, welcome the live stream, audience who are listening right now, live, and that if they want to send questions, they can email to info@ccepa.ca, info@ccepa.ca, or tweet at publicethicsca, or send us a Facebook message, and they'll probably pass on these questions to me, and a lucky few will ask. We make sure when you ask a question, it's a question, not a statement, if you could. Okay, so we're going to just get right into it, I think. I'll just do quick introductions of everybody here, the distinguished panel. We'll start with Dr. David DEANE. Raise your hand, David. There you, you have a sign in front of you anyways. He's Associate Professor of Theology at the Atlantic School of Theology. His books include Nietzsche and Theology, and a really great title of a forthcoming book called Resisting the Tyranny of the Banal. That's good. Dr. SARA KIRK is a professor of health promotion at Dalhousie University and the scientific director of Healthy Populations Institute at Dow, and a female scientist, yes. Her program of research explores how we can create supportive environments for chronic disease prevention. Dr. Rob Strang is very well known to most of us Nova Scotians. He's Chief Medical Officer of Health. Dr. Strang's role is to provide leadership on initiatives to support optimum health for all Nova Scotians. And Dr. Michael VALLIS is a psychologist practicing at Capital Health and is appointed to Dal University as Associate Professor in Family Medicine and Psychiatry and Adjunct Professor in Psychology and Health and Human Performance. His main area of expertise is adult health psychology with an emphasis on diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular risk, and GI. Welcome. So on this fabulous, juicy topic of gluttony, we're going to give everybody on the panel to give their 2-minute perspective right off the top. So I'm going to just start with Dr. Strang there and move in. So do you want to go, Rob?
Great, thank you, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to talk, in my 2 minutes, I think that it's simplistic. We say obesity and gluttony, and I think we look at them very simplistically. First of all, we often say that obesity is because of overeating or gluttony. It's far more complex than that. Certainly what you eat, how much you eat, but more importantly, what you eat is part of it, but it also depends on your genetics, your biochemistry, your metabolism, a whole range of other factors that it's much more complex than just what you're eating and how much you're eating. Secondly, we say gluttony, it puts us right into the area of, far too often say it's because of an individual responsibility. It's what somebody's making choices themselves, and we put it all on the individual. Where like so many things, yes, there is a role for personal responsibility, but that's in the context of a whole range of social, cultural, economic factors. And so our ability to control our environment and make healthier choices is very much governed by the context of how we grew up, from prenatal all the way through to all the factors around us. And the third thing is that too often as simplistically we look at somebody's health and make a judgment on their health based on their weight. So if you're overweight or obese, then we look at somebody as they're unhealthy. Whereas the reality is that you could have somebody who is normal weight, but they're sedentary, they never move around, they have a terrible diet, they smoke, whatever. They're just lucky because of their metabolism and genetics that they're normal weight. Somebody who is what we would call overweight or obese could still be living a very healthy lifestyle, but we would make judgment about those two people's health, where in fact the person who is living a healthy lifestyle but is what we would call overweight is far healthier than the person with an unhealthy lifestyle who is normal weight. So I think we look at it simplistically, and it's far more complicated than that.
Thanks, Rob. Sarah?
Okay, I have to write my words down, otherwise I'll probably waffle a bit. But so as Rob mentions, our behavior is shaped by the world around us through our physical, economic, social, and political environments. This makes the historical notion of gluttony as a sin, focused as it is on individual agency, somewhat problematic to health promotion and population health, which is the lens that I'm bringing to this conversation. And let me explain what I mean by that. Well, people, like animals, are biologically programmed to eat and to overeat when food is available. And if food is not available, we are biologically programmed to seek it out, even if that means expending energy to do so. This tendency to overconsume is an evolutionary mechanism designed to guard against one of the biggest threats that we face as humans, which is that of starvation. So gluttony is actually a valuable protective mechanism in times of food scarcity. But because gluttony is traditionally framed as a moral failing, it does not allow for sufficient consideration of those broader factors that influence our food consumption. Our food environment, I think you'll all agree, has changed dramatically in the last 60 years and is now characterized by widespread availability of energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods that are actually designed to promote overconsumption. After all, the business model of the food industry depends on that. And this is where things become messy, because gluttony is only really viewed as a problem when it is accompanied by weight gain. Yet not all gluttony will lead to weight gain, and weight gain is not always the consequence of gluttony. It is much more complex than that, as Rob has already mentioned. In other words, we need to uncouple gluttony from the weight status and consider better ways to support everyone to achieve good health through good food. So despite gluttony being something that can apply to most people at some point, we only ever see it as a character flaw when it comes to people living in larger bodies. That's not to say individual responsibility has no role, but we need to see that bigger picture and address the factors that challenge all of us to achieve or maintain good health, regardless of our body weight or shape. Instead, when we see people living in larger bodies, we judge them, we blame them, and we shame them. That so many of us are okay with that approach is, to me, the greatest sin.
David?
Hi. If I can take a couple of minutes to explain why traditionally gluttony was seen as one of the 7 deadly sins, I can frame my approach to the topic. Food was seen in the medieval context within Judaism, Islam, and Christianity as something one ideally approached hungry. And so when we approach it hungry, we're eating it in a spirit of thankfulness. We take great joy and great pleasure in it. And it becomes, within Islamic thought, within Christian and Jewish thought, an icon of God. And so when we approach it, we give thanks to the source where it comes from. Also, when we approach it hungry, we come to empathize with other people in the world who are hungry. And so it binds us and connects us with the source of all life, and it binds us and connects us with others. Gluttony is seen as problematic as one of a whole host of problematic desires, where instead of seeing creation as something we engage and appreciate in relationship to God and others, we seek to take a part of it and commodify it and mine it for our own ends. We can do that with food, we can do it with people, we can do it with the natural order, and not necessarily food itself in isolation, but this desire is the reason why gluttony is considered problematic in the Christian past. And that's really the lens that I'm interested in. Why do we desire to commodify parts of the created order and utilize them and mine them for endorphins, for serotonin, for a whole host of things in ways that can seal us off from the source of all life and each other, particularly those in need?
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you. So I want to introduce this conversation around the behavioral lens. And the questions really that I would bring are, is gluttony a sin? And if it is, whose sin is it? The individual's or society's? I'd like to just reflect on 4 points around behavior. And the first is, how do we operate? What is the sort of behavioral drive? And our primary drive is survival. And so how do you understand the survival instinct? Approach pleasure and stay away from pain. So our brain is really designed to set us up in that dynamic. Of course, let's talk about health behavior. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, it's minus 20 degrees. You can go for a walk or stay in bed. Now think about approaching pleasure and avoiding pain. So there's something very human about that. The second point I'd like to make is, what are the behavioral control systems in the brain? It turns out we have 2 behavioral control systems. The initial operating system, called the iOS-1, which is located just behind your earlobe, about 1/3 of the way into your brain. It's called the limbic system. And it sends the following messages: I want it, I want it all, I want it now. This is our emotional brain, which by the way is on 24/7. Then we have on the frontal lobes, just behind your forehead, we have the executive functions of the brain. This is your logical brain. Those of you old enough to remember the original Spock, or Star Trek rather, will remember Spock versus Kirk. And this is played out time and time again. Now the challenge is the frontal lobes aren't fully developed in girls until the ages of 23 to 25, not fully developed in boys till the ages of 27 to 29. So here we have these 2 systems. Apples are always better for you than apple pies. That's your limbic, that's your frontal lobes. Apple pies always taste better than apples. That's your limbic system. Good luck. And so what do we know about behavior? We are oriented to our environment. The strongest predictor of what you eat is what's available. The strongest predictor of how much you eat is what's available. And why do we eat? For social connectedness. If I like you, I'll feed you. Tell me a culture on this planet that does not use food as part of every single celebratory ritual. So how normal can that be? And then final point, behavior change. How do you help people change if they find themselves in a situation they label problematic? And shaming and blaming, as Sarah will tell you, is the wrong way to go. You have to understand behavior. You have to provide a supportive context that allows people to find value and meaning in their lives to be empowered. Thank you.
Wow. Very good. 4 very fascinating people there. I'm really impressed with the choice for tonight's panel. Okay, we're going to start with the first question, which is a historical question. So we're going to look at what is our historical understanding of gluttony through an ethical, biblical, sociological, and policy lens. And maybe I'm just going to start. David, is this appealing to you?
Okay, yeah.
And who else wants to come in afterwards?
Okay, so gluttony obviously is considered problematic in the Bible, and it's considered problematic primarily because that within the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the idea is that creation is finite. Okay, so creation is understood as finite. Everything that isn't God is understood as finite. So think of a big apple pie. If person A has a bigger slice of the apple pie, person B must get less of the apple pie. And so there's a fundamental interrelationship between overconsumption and underconsumption. Now this is usually seen economically, but food is simply a token of this. The problem is not necessarily with eating or even overeating. The problem is with a desire to consume more when one is not sensitive to the needs of others. And so this is considered a problem biblically, and it's considered a problem for all 3 Abrahamic traditions. And it's a problem, again, that food is only one epiphenomenon of. The issue is with how do we desire rightly? How can we? And so we have from Sarah and Michael some really good understandings of what we are biologically. But is it possible to shape this thing such that this thing can share, can be less inclined to consume more, can be less inclined to spend thousands of dollars on their children when there's other children who are going hungry? What is it that drives this impulse? And so, when we think about gluttony, if we isolate it to food, we're abstracting it from its historical context, where it wasn't understood as being about food. Food was simply one marker for a fundamentally problematic desire that was socially destructive. I think, and in the contemporary framework, we definitely need to take it away from the individual context by virtue of the fact what happens, and this is what people like Ibn Sina or from the Christian perspective, Thomas Aquinas can't imagine. Yes, it's at the level of desire, but what happens when the entire social order is designed to poke that desire? When every time you drive down the street, you're looking at billboards, you're looking at color patterns that are designed to stimulate desire. When I watch TV and I see an ad for a car that tells me, if you have this car, you'll be happy. If you have this person, you'll be happy. If you smell like this, you'll be happy. Constantly trying to poke and arouse my desire for certain things.
I'm going to ask Sarah now, because it's interesting in terms of historic perspective on gluttony. We evolve as humans, we think, but sometimes we just remain human, as we can tell by certain leaders in the Western world, that we don't evolve very much. But anyways, so our bodies taught us to be hungry. It taught us to seek sugar and fruit. It taught us we had to in order to survive. Is modernity, in terms of the historical perspective, is modernity just not suited? Is historically our bodies just not suited for today's time? Would you say?
Well, that's certainly an argument that you could make, that we have not evolved in the same, or our food environment has changed so dramatically, so quickly, that we haven't been able to adjust to that. We haven't evolved to kind of take into account that pace of change. And as David mentions, there are people, there are pressures out there that are deliberately trying to get us to overconsume. And gluttony is actually being encouraged by some corporate entities.
And we don't have to hunt and gather and do all that stuff. Michael?
I think we can fairly say that healthy behavior is now really abnormal behavior. It's much more easy to engage in the unhealthy behavior. And so the context has changed dramatically. And to talk about modernity, if you look at that limbic system that I talked about, which is so powerful, the following two substances light up the limbic system equally. And those two substances are sugar and cocaine. Sugar and cocaine have been demonstrated to have exactly the same effect on the limbic system. So we have this calorie-rich, nutrition-poor food supply that literally lights up our brains like drugs.
Do you want to add anything, Rob, on this one, on the historical?
No, I think Sarah's exactly right. I mean, the pace of human evolution is far slower than cultural evolution. Mm-hmm. Look at how different our culture is even from 20 years ago, especially in the world of social media and how things have changed. But even you go to how our food systems were 50, 100 years ago and how we all lived. And so from a policy perspective, it's really difficult because you can't roll back the clock. But how do we have the courage to actually counter some of the economic corporate influences out there that David's talked about, and say from a public policy perspective, we actually have to put some controls on that because we can't change enough fast enough as human beings. So how do we actually slow down some of that change to protect ourselves from all these corporate influences that are driving us to an unhealthy behaviors?
We're about to ask a question from the audience, so just sort of get ready to put your hand up. But I'm just going to ask you one quick question. In terms of historically, do you think that gluttony before was seen as more of a sin than it is now? I mean, did people, would they have thought it sinful to go into a restaurant and see a huge plate for a cheap meal than perhaps during the 1930s or the 20s? Does anybody want to, I mean, historically, have we changed our perspective on gluttony?
Well, maybe if you look at other cultures, I mean, it wasn't, it was in the 1800s where the celebrated female body image was the Rubenesque image. There's other cultures, more traditional cultures, where it was valued to be large. Because knowing that, because in those cultures, food was scarce. And so to be large and be able to consume enough to be a large size, clearly you had some power to be able to access all that food. So we've changed it all around. So. Okay,
so we're on a fairly tight schedule. So sorry, I'll remember you next time. Okay, Lydia has a microphone. Do you want to walk over here to Lydia, or can she come to you? And it's just not a statement, I hate to say, just a question if possible, because sometimes. Okay, and then I'll.
No, okay, I find it a little uncomfortable to be so close to you, but that's okay. I will make a statement, a short one, rather than a question. What I hear.
What do you say?
What I hear is a pervasive cover stating that the external influences, commercial pressures, and all that is making us. I will put in opposition to this that on the other side is education and awareness, what is best for my health and my longevity. So
if you were to frame that in an ethical question, would you say that is it society's responsible for the education?
Okay, let me expand a little bit on that. I come from the generation where I know that when I was little and my parents had no problem with gluttony, because number one, they were moving, number two, they didn't have enough, they didn't have in the fridge, they ate 3 meals a day, they did the best they could. Ultimately, my mother lived 95, and what happened here, I'll make it very short.
Yes.
In my view, what happened is that we got divorced. We don't work for food. We're not on the farms. Most of us sit on our butts 8.5 hours. We come home, we open fridge wide, and here comes the entertainment. And I'll make that point when the food comes to be an entertainment, and I mentioned it to one of the panels, and I am not a bibliophile or theologian, but already in the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes, it says, "Blessed is the land where the kings don't eat for drunkenness, replaced with entertainment, and they eat for sustenance."
Okay, that's
so
really...
what we need, and I will finish it.
Yeah, okay.
What we need to hit the button of reset in all of us, that we eat for health, and then step number 2 is learn what is healthy. Carbohydrates and fats are empty nutrition. There is nothing valuable in carbohydrates, in potatoes, and I will stop right
I only
here.
have to stop you, and I hate to be rude. It's just that we're on a timeline here, and the library's going to kick us out at a certain time because they do want to go home to their families. But I think what I might parse from that is it wrong? Is it ethically wrong that food is entertainment? Because I agree what he says, that it has become entertainment, that it has become a habit in some ways as opposed to necessity or sustenance. So is it ethically wrong to treat food that way? Who wants to deal with that?
Well, I just like to touch on the education aspect just very briefly, if that's okay, because I think that education is definitely part of the solution, but it's actually, I think, an overblown part of the solution, because it assumes, so obesity tends to be more prevalent in socially disadvantaged areas, and it assumes that these people don't realize that a salad is more healthy than a Big Mac meal, and that's not the case. What we have is a situation, I think, and this is why the SARA plays a role. Someone can, go for a jog, speak at a panel like this and sort of receive plaudits and go home feeling 10 foot tall. They can do a whole host of things that will raise their feelings of self-worth, and they can get all those neurochemicals through this process. Someone else might not be able, but they can eat a Big Mac, and for a short period of time, they can feel really good. So this is one of the issues that we have. Why do we desire this? And I think Robert made the point that we need to sort of maybe shape a society which doesn't keep poking our desire. That will be the day.
I'm going to slow you down now. I'm going to keep going it because I've been told to keep this going. But I am though curious about this whole idea of how much pleasure should we be allowed to have in food as opposed to the pure necessity of food? So is it wrong to okay, thanks, Michael.
We can address that issue very quickly. I'll do a very quick personality test of everyone in the audience. I'm going to give you an opportunity to put yourself in one of two categories, and you cannot sit on the fence. So I'll tell you the categories, and then I'll get you to put your hands up. So you either eat to live, food for you is fuel, or you live to eat. Put your hands up, those of you who live to eat, and eat to live. Yeah. So there you go. So you'll never be able to eliminate.
So what would you conclude for the audience who can't see the hands? What do you conclude from what happened?
The people that live to eat will struggle with food choices. They will be inclined towards food because they live to eat, and they will be oriented towards food. They'll be more responsive to ads. Their brains will light up brighter. And so that we really need to accept that. And the positive choices, so I would sort of share with you that the literature on education, improving knowledge to change behavior, shows that it does not work. My very first study when I came to Halifax was looking at people living with diabetes who were super good, they did everything they were supposed to do, and those that were super not good and were doing very little that they were asked to do. And those that were doing very, very little knew way more about diabetes management than those that were actually in good control. The key to health behavior change is meaning. So it's not, why can't you choose apple over apple pie? But the question really is, what's important enough in your life to choose apples for? And if you can line up your personal values, your meaning, what is really essential for you, then what you'll find is the hard work of resisting temptations and fighting against some of the environmental factors that pull us towards unhealth is actually a lot easier.
We'll go to the next question now. And I'll ask Sarah if you don't mind, if you're interested in it. If not, we'll give it to Rob. What is at the root of excessive consumption? Sarah?
Oh my goodness, that is
just a simple question.
I would say biology has a major part in that. We are biologically driven to overconsume when food is available. And and I think also now we have like I say, the food environment has changed. The taste and texture of food. I'm thinking that Michael probably is actually a better person to comment on some of these from the psychological literature, because I think, there's many things, and perhaps the most important thing is that it's a complex issue. There's no one thing that is at the root. There's multiple things that I would say.
And emotion is not part of food, Michael?
Yeah. Have you ever gone on a first date without food? Could you imagine having a Christmas party, no food? So it's part of our society. If I like you, I'll feed you. If we can't train our medical students without feeding them, because the first thing that a resident will ask when you say, "Are you going to rounds?" is there food?
But what about? But the question here, and specifically, and I'll go to Rob, is that it's that excessive consumption. So we all love food. We like food. We like to break the bread with our families. But why are we pushed towards excess? Rob?
Well, I think what Sarah's pointed out is that it is biologically driven. And it comes back to the earlier comments around the pace of human evolution versus the pace of cultural evolution. So you put that our biology into an environment where there is always food, and there's food pushed at us from marketing, advertising, etc. We're driven to food because our lives are so busy, and we got to get something quickly. All those societal factors, on top of that biological piece, we're set up, unless we have to take very deliberate action to counteract it and work really hard at not having excessive consumption, we're set up to as a culture to overconsume and have all the consequences that come from that.
And we're going to talk more about corporate in a bit. And now I'm going to take a question from online. This is sort of an interesting ethical question, I guess. Is it useful to extend the idea of gluttony to the overuse of natural resources? David?
Definitely. I think that what we just heard is definitely part of the piece. And if I consume a huge amount of food because my body is telling me I need to, because there might be a famine coming around the corner, everything that we've heard makes sense. But I'm a glutton. And I'm not gluttonous at shared meals at Christmas. I'm not gluttonous eating regular meals. I'm gluttonous on a Sunday afternoon eating a bag of Cheetos that are that size. Now, what's happening when I do that? Similarly, what's happening when I binge watch Netflix? Similarly, what's happening when I use up environmental resources far greater than I need? So there are patterns of desiring, there are patterns of consuming that certainly my biology makes me entirely prone for, but I'm also being activated by a society which requires me to do this. Netflix requires that I binge watch, Our entire capitalist system requires that we milk the natural order far beyond capacity. It requires that I desire this car, that I desire these clothes, that I desire this phone. And so I think we definitely need to see this apart from the specifics of food.
Do you feel sinful, you're a professor of theology, when you have that full bag and don't leave any?
Yes. I realize that so in Dante's Inferno, one of the most terrifying creatures in the whole thing is the she-wolf, and the she-wolf is the totem for this kind of behavior. She's possessed of a ravenous hunger, and this hunger ultimately is understood by Abrahamic traditions as a hunger for meaning, a hunger for love, a hunger for the peace that passeth all understanding. But she tries to find it in things in the world, commodities. And every time she eats, she gets hungrier and hungrier and hungrier because she's eating emptiness. And so when I eat a bag of Cheetos, I think I'm looking for something that the Cheetos can't give me. And I'm consuming emptiness. and I'm just getting hungrier and hungrier and hungrier. And so when I speak about sin, I don't mean that God is up there wagging God's finger. That's what I mean, that my relationship with that which is out of whack, and that's why I binge watch Netflix, that's why I use more commodities than I need, and that's why I sit down bacon flavored Cheetos.
And I just want to, I want to see if one of the other three will sort of take up on this question again, because I'm going to repeat it one more time, and it's a really thoughtful question. Is it useful to extend the idea of gluttony to the overuse of natural resources? And you think about when you're growing up and you don't finish your plate and your mother says there's somebody starving in whatever country that is. But it's interesting how that is such a common trait to use, and even myself sometimes with my child I might throw a bit of guilt. But talk about, do you want to talk, who would like to talk about the resources? Would you?
Okay. There's a term that's used, but it's intergenerational theft. So we're consuming everything for now, because our whole world, as David's point, our whole economic order is driven about maximizing wealth, maximizing profits now, for today, and without regard to the consequences for the future. So that intergenerational theft, and it's a very important concept in terms of sustainable environments, all those pieces. So our collective gluttony, driven by a capitalist society, has landed us in a world with all sorts of problems around sustainability.
Okay, is it okay if I keep going? Sure. Okay, just in light of time, but I'll go to Michael or Sarah, whoever wants to take this first. The third question is, what is the relationship between gluttony and obesity? Who, Sarah or Michael? Michael, there you go.
Sure. Well, there's a sort of a loose relationship there. I mean, we know that if you expose a group of people to the same number of calories, you'll get a wide range of weight-related changes. Obesity is really rampant in sort of the industrialized nations of the world, and we believe a lot of it is because we don't have the capacity really to process exactly how much we eat. So many of us eat really quickly. We eat while we're watching other things, or for instance, a bagel today is 3 times the caloric content of a bagel 30 years ago. And yet eating a bagel is a single act. When you have a bagel, it has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And you're not finished the bagel until you get to the end. And so it doesn't matter whether it's 3 times the amount of calories, it's just the same kind of consumption. So we very naturally find ourselves in that situation where, because of that gluttony, you then develop obesity. But then, remember, the healthiest group of society are the individuals living with overweight. When you start looking at your risk of death, you find that the death rate goes up when you reach high levels of obesity, and it goes up when you are in the lower ends of the BMI. But the sort of BMI sort of span that seems to keep people most healthy is when they have a little bit of extra weight, because then they can withstand an illness, etc. So it's really interesting that is obesity just bad? Is it risk connected to gluttony? And I think it's way more complicated. And people can have an interabdominal fat, so you may not be very large, but if your fat is all inside your muscles in your abdomen, and that your internal organs are bathed in fat, fat is not an inert substance. Fat is now considered to be an endocrine organ, and therefore it's that interabdominal fat that will actually be associated with health problems. So people can have problems with weight that not be significantly overweight.
This question seems to speak to me, and I could be completely wrong, but what is the relationship between gluttony and obesity? That whole idea of that gluttony is sin, and if you're obese, that you have a moral responsibility to this. So, I mean, I know a lot of people think that. So how would you address that, Rob or Sarah? Rob, I guess I'll go first.
Well, I mean, as I said at the outset, I mean, that's far too simplistic.
But it happens all the time.
It happens all the time, and what it does is leads us to make collectively. We make all sorts of judgments and negative judgments around people who are overweight, because we assume that they're overweight because they've overeaten, and it's all their own responsibility. But be somebody who's overweight. That's one of the few remaining things left in society that it's okay to actually to actively stigmatize somebody about. So, and a lot of that feeds out of because we make these moral judgments about somebody's failing because of the size of their body, and we assume, make assumptions of how they got to that size.
David, you called yourself what did you say, that you like gluttony? What was it? How did you frame it?
Well, that I have been gluttonous for much of my life.
And does that, when they talk about that, do you feel sometimes this is a relationship between gluttony and obesity, that kind of sin, or does it ever get to you, into your heart, or do you put that aside?
Well, I'm not 100% sure that it is the moral lens that leads to fat shaming. So, for example, the quote-unquote illicit desire that I have when I'm being gluttonous would be similar enough to someone who has an illicit desire for shoes, or someone who binge watches Netflix, or any of these things. We don't stigmatize any of these manifestations of overconsumption. We stigmatize people like me who are fat. Therefore, because we stigmatize me and not them, I'm not sure it's the moral choices that are leading to the stigmatization of me. I think it's something more complex and nuanced. I think it comes from a couple of things. One, it's an issue of class and power. You know, and that ultimately things like obesity and smoking are more and more now things which represent people from socioeconomically deprived backgrounds. And so they're markers for these kinds of things. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons. And so it's not so much the morality, like we speak all the time, and everyone here has spoken so eloquently about the neurological factors which determine our choices in food. Many of the acts of fat shaming, whether consciously expressed or not expressed, they're also determined by similar neurological practices, So yes, definitely we ought not fat shame, and fat shaming is a terrible thing. But when we do, I'm not sure it's entirely because we are saying that your overconsumption is a fundamental moral problem. Rather, you're icky. Why are you icky? I'm not 100% sure, but I know you're icky.
And I like, it's true about the socioeconomic, if you think about it. In part, it has to do with if you're poor, it's pasta. If you're poor, it's carbohydrates. And then, there's that Thomas Wolfe wrote about in one of his books, the social X-rays, talking about the, women on Park Avenue in New York and how obsessively skinny they are. And if you go to the consignment stores in New York, like I like to do, they're all size 0. And I feel it seems sad too. I have empathy for them as well. I think we should take a question from the audience now. And over here, do you still want to ask a question up there? No?
I do.
I have to get Lydia to go to you if that's okay. Lydia, you still do, or you're, okay. Lydia, up there, top row. Black shirt. Oh, there's probably a lot of black shirts.
She's going to hold the mic. She knows where to put it. So I hear the individual in our heritage, we have, it's built in. It's a built-in mechanism. But so is the mechanism of conserving food, of making sure that the food lasts through the seasons. That's also built into us. But that seems to have gone kind of out with the Industrial Revolution. I kind of tie it to the Industrial Revolution. So I wonder how much of gluttony is actually about being absent. Absent in our actions, not thoughtful and present in the taste of food, in the nobility of food, so that in our busyness, we feel it, we have to eat, right? And so in our busyness, rather than putting it to this idea that overeating is built into us. Maybe it's more about we've come so out of whack and being present within ourselves with the busyness around us, including education, including all the conditioning that we have received around what is healthy, that we are so out of track with our interior that gluttony or the lack of presence in our action is what has thrown, it plays, how much of that actually plays in this.
That is so poetic and beautiful. So I'm really happy that you asked that question. Lack of presence, that's Michael.
So I like your comments. I think they really speak to a lot of processes. You talk about conservatism. What's interesting about that around food is that you will only conserve when your supply gets limited. So when you open up a very large bag, you'll be fairly frivolous in your behavior. But when you start to realize that your resource is getting limited, then you start to conserve. So we didn't start to conserve for the getting through the season until we started to run out of food. And so we no longer run out of food. We have this endless supply of food, so we never really hit that point. Your second point around being mindful around what we eat is actually really, really important. But to remember that the baseline is that we are actually quite mindless when it comes to food. So when you look at how people consume foods, the factors that drive what we eat are primarily the behavioral contextual factors. So there's very good studies saying things like dietitians have no ability to estimate how much they eat if you give them an endless bowl of soup. So you give a dietitian a bowl of soup, but you have it gravity fed. So every time they take a spoonful out, it's the same level. And then you say, tell me when you've stopped and how much did you eat? They have no clue how much they've eaten. And these are professional dietitians who are the best people we know around estimating food. The size of the bowl determines how much you eat, etc. So it is actually a really important point. Second, we've lost touch with internal cues. And so there is some real merit in taking what we call a mindful approach to separating eating from other behaviors, to really examining and spending time really, paying attention to the food that we're eating and starting to appreciate the food, both in a palatable sense, but also in a broader sense of, serving a meal to someone that you've prepared has a lot more joy in it than eating the same meal that you've kind of ordered in. So I think your comments are really, really nicely put.
A friend of mine, and I used to love it about her, she would thank the vegetables, she would thank all her food, everything on her plate for giving her sustenance before she ate it. In her head, her father was this organic farmer in Quebec, and I just thought that was a beautiful thing to take a moment and think about things. But Rob, if you don't eat at your lunch at your desk, if you go off somewhere and sit, you're one of the few, and you're kind of looked down upon, I think, that if you're trying to be present with food, it's not something that society thinks looks down upon, is perhaps sinful to take time off for yourself, maybe for dinner, but everything is rushed.
No, it's one of the key, one of many factors that drives us to extreme time pressure. You got to get out the door in the morning, get the kids off to school. Despite the talk about take back the lunch, you're pressured. You rarely get a lunch. After everybody's got activities, all those things that have driven out the space to have, as to Michael's term, a mindful meal. That has more of the social context around it.
But
so we just eat. We just throw food in, and what's out there, highly processed, calorie dense, poorly food it has lacks nutrients, but it's easy and available and it's quick.
I wonder too that we think about culturally, and it used to be culturally, you'd think in Ethiopia, I love the idea of the bread, not bread, but it's like a bread, like a flat bread that everybody shares and puts the food on top. And I'm from an Arabic background, and food is hugely important. That's all we talk about. And this is a great story. A friend of mine was a writer, and he went to see his mother on her deathbed in the hospital, and she was Lebanese, and dying with hospital food is a sin for Arabs. And so he made her tabbouleh, and she took the tabbouleh and she took a bite, and her last words on earth were, too much lemon. But we are, you know, but the thing is that I had a point there, but now I got consumed by that joke. I'm going to move on to the next question, because how much of what we consume is driven by deliberate corporate initiatives? Do we even have a chance, Sarah?
Yeah, so I think this is a very interesting point. And I just want to actually go back to the last point, though, because I think one of the other issues that we have is this disconnection from where our food comes from, how it is prepared, you know, all those kind of things as well that we've had. But yeah, the food that's available to us is often not the type of food that is nourishing to us. And I think we've kind of taken away some of the parts of food that are really important, the social aspects, eating together, those kind of things. So we still do those sort of things, but we rush meals, we buy things on the go. One of the biggest trends now within Canadian eating habits is actually eating food outside of the home. Whereas when I was a child, that was one thing, we did that maybe once a year, you know. So if we think about all of these different things that are pushing us, and yes, people are making a decision about how to shape our food behaviors, because that drives profit. So the food industry, I think, I'm not here to bash the food industry in case anybody thinks that I am, but I think we also need to be a lot more critical of what the food industry is doing. But any attempts to restructure our food environment, a lot of my research is around ways that we could actually shape our environment to provide healthier food. That gets such a lot of pushback. People do not want to have their food environment altered in any shape or form. This idea of, you're denying me my freedom of choice, when we think about things like sugar taxes, or this idea that this is the action of a nanny state. We hear that a lot, and particularly from, the UK, that was a sort of a major kind of theme several years ago with the government, looking at some of these things that they could do to restrict access to unhealthy foods. But I would argue that we don't have freedom of choice now. I don't have freedom of choice to eat the foods that I would like to eat, the healthy foods at different places. You go out for a meal, and often the fruit and veg portion is minuscule. So we need to be, I think, a little bit more critical in how we see these things.
There was an article, there's been some articles in the New York Times about obesity rates that are really soaring in places like India, and there was some in Latin American countries, and it is about the McDonald's of the world. Before, I remember I lived in India once, there was Wimpy's, which was a British, but it was Indian food you bought, and you bought omelets at made right away at the station, and there was chai tea. But is it what kind of cultural sort of genocide, what kind of role does food play when the big corporations go into India per se, or any of the countries, and bring their corporate brand? Is that some kind of cultural genocide, if you know what I mean?
I would agree with that. I think one of the challenges is really finding ways of viewing this as a very complex social phenomenon where really there's no major player cannot participate in the solutions. And I think part of the challenge that we face is, the sort of food industry operates kind of independently from the health system, and that it operate, independently from other systems. And I don't think the health system is really going to address this issue. I think we're left with the consequences of people that struggle with that issue. I think it's a much more social and moral and a level of a problem that really needs to involve policymakers and industry really very significantly in part of the solution. Because right now we just see, they've got pops out of school, great. So what do? They bring in sport drink, which is just pop without the fizz.
We have a question from online, and anybody can answer this first. Why do people react so strongly to, in quotation marks, fat people? Why do we feel so morally superior?
Can I take that quickly? There's two normal psychological processes that help us to understand that. And the first one is, what do you tell your children, right? You'll tell your children, if you want to achieve something in life, you just work hard for it. Tell me you don't tell that to your child. So we start to, at a very early age, learn that if you want something, you work hard for it. So if you're in an unfortunate situation, if you are in a situation that, is undesirable, well, you're lazy. You just didn't work hard. So from this normal sort of individual drive determinism, which is kind of a very healthy psychological strategy, from that we can blame people. And the second normal psychological process is, we call it the just world hypothesis. If something tragic happens in your life, you'll have 3 questions that you need to address, and they are why, and why. You need to try to explain your world and help you and make sense of the world. And from that, bad things only happen to bad people. So people living with a significant obesity somehow are lazy and they deserve it. So that shaming that comes from that, we believe, starts with what are really sort of normal, healthy psychological characteristics, and why I would say that addressing the obesity bias issue is really an affirmative action issue, that we all have to collectively take responsibility for how this begins, but correct it as it goes awry.
Why is it one of the last isms that's acceptable? Why is it that people still think they can do that, wants to deal with this as well?
I would agree with everything that that Michael says. French philosopher Michel Foucault tells a very interesting story in his 2-volume History of Sexuality, where he speaks about how paleness is considered extremely attractive in the France of the Ancien regime, and so when people are working in the fields, the aristocracy had faces which were that color, and it was considered extremely attractive and desirable because it signified power. These people had never had to do a day's work in their lives. Then the Industrial Revolution comes along and everyone goes into factories, and so then the working class start to have faces which are this color, and all of a sudden tanned faces start to become extremely attractive because these are people who go to the Riviera. So what we consider attractive and desirable often connotes power and sophistication, and so we're oriented towards that. And as obesity is a problem of increasingly the marginalized, I saw it was a newspaper report recently which looked at the pyramid in big corporations, and it was looking at the 1970s, and at the top in the 1970s of the pyramid with the CEOs, etc., you have white males, and then you have white females, and then the janitorial staff are often from racially minority positions. If you look at the main tech companies along the West Coast today, and you look at that pyramid, it's by BMI. And so you have extremely lean people at the top, and the janitorial staff are obese. And so what we consider attractive is not something that we're entirely, part of it is definitely hardwired into us, but an awful lot other is determined by our social context. And that legitimizes a reflexive revulsion towards the obese. No one is going to say, yes, hell yes, I despise fat people. It's going to be reflexive and it's going to be manifest. In the University of Nottingham recently, there was a student newspaper, so I'm not sure how seriously it can be taken, but among undergrads, more people said that they would like to live paralyzed than live obese.
Oh my goodness.
So these are some of the realities of life in 2018.
I just realized, and my apologies, but this sort of goes into our next question. And so we say, why do we negatively judge quote unquote fat people, and why don't we similarly judge the skinny glutton? Rob, or Sarah, sorry, Sarah.
Yeah, well, no, I was just going to say it is because it's a visible representation. When somebody is of a higher body weight, then we can see that. Whereas when somebody is gluttonous and skinny, that isn't necessarily quite so obvious. So I think there's a lot to do with that. But absolutely, it's a social construction of how we view attractiveness in modern society. It's part of how we frame things. Yeah.
But it's also so that you're also seeing that skinny person in models is, oh, I eat so much, I eat more than the average person. There's that sort of sense of accomplishment there. That so, no, Michael, do you? Yeah.
I only believe very little of that when I hear it, because I suspect that it's actually not true. But when it is true, I find it really a bit sad, because what we're hearing is we want to model off of people who don't have a problem. So we're trying to solve a problem looking at people who don't have the problem. Because if you can eat that much and not gain any weight, well, then you don't have the problem. And so how can you help me with the solution, right? It's like when you look at people who can resist food and you think, oh, I wish I had that willpower. Well, chances are they don't like that food. So they're not engaging in all this willpower to avoid it. They actually prefer to not eat it. So it's not really a problem. So I think it's really important for us to try to determine, and I don't think we've got a good handle on this, but what would be our good role models? Who should we be promoting? And I think a shape-accepting society would certainly provide a much better context to understand. One of the things that I'm sad to tell you, but after the age of 30, your silhouette will not change. So if you're an apple, and you carry your weight in your midsection, you can be a big apple or a small apple. But the apple, which is often the male shape, never becomes an inverted pyramid. And if you're a pear and have your weight in your hips and thighs, well, you could be a big pear or a small pear, but you'll never turn into an hourglass.
I bet a Beverly Hills plastic surgeon would say.
And I bet they would as well.
I'm just going to add something because the question, I think it's all about, we put these moral judgments.
Yeah.
So we see somebody that's fat, we make these judgments that they got there because they ate too much, and that's their own fault. And so we all too often go to those kind of judgments, that's line of thinking, and therefore we make. We blame those people and we stigmatize them.
So I'll make a quick comment because this is actually a really important point. I spend a lot of my time on this issue. The most valuable question I like to ask when I see somebody in my clinical practice around living with obesity is, how did you get to be the weight? How did you get to be the weight that you are? And I can tell you, when you ask that question, you'll be amazed at how few people ate their way into that situation. When you start to ask that question, how did you get to be the weight that you are, you will find an amazing number of medical, biological, environmental, illness-related, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some contribution to eating, but in my experience, working with people living with obesity, to just attribute it to gluttonous overeating is a real misnomer of what's really driving the weight in our society.
What is our moral responsibility as a society towards obesity, Rob?
Well, I think we have to accept that there's a whole range of sizes and shapes, and that's perfectly fine. And I would love it if we stopped talking about weight altogether. We are far too focused on weight, even in the health system, as opposed to what are the health behaviors that you have regardless of your weight. And the only reason we should be talking about our food environment around healthy eating. How do we create environments that all of us can eat a health? We're supported to eat a much more healthy diet, and it doesn't matter what weight we're in. We need to change the conversation altogether and forget about weight. Throw away the scale.
And maybe gluttony is too tied to weight. The whole concept. Do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, and I think we need to uncouple it. And as I said that at the beginning, it's something that we really need to move away from. And Rob just said it brilliantly. And I think also, just to go back to the comment that Michael made earlier around healthy behavior is abnormal behavior. And until we switch that around again, then, and that applies to everybody. So let's take the weight out of the equation. Let's think of it in terms of health behaviors. You cannot control your weight as well as you think you can. You can control your behaviors.
If it's, what is the role of the government then in controlling behaviors? Because if we have this onslaught from marketing, from fast foods, what is the role of government, Rob?
Well, it depends. My own philosophy is government has to be in the middle of that, putting some as a governor, trying to push back some of that unfettered capitalism. If the corporations are legally mandated to maximize their profits. So unless government is in there playing a role, saying that's enough, you can only go so far with your profit maximization, we will get the Donald Trump view of the world, where it's all about profits and the vast majority of the population bears the impact of it. So my belief is that there's a strong role for government, and not everybody agrees with that. I fight this inside government. And you should see the pressures that whether it's the food industry, the alcohol industry, whatever, the pressure they put to bear on governments when government even talks about the federal government right now is making some significant steps in a federal healthy eating strategy. The pressure that is being applied to the federal government by the food industry is unbelievable. So governments need to then be supported by a population that says we value health more than profits.
The big irony of Trump is about gluttony and how he despises anybody or any woman who has any weight on them, and yet he himself has a weight problem. But then again, my grandmother, who was always really beautifully large, always would talk about other people who were about this size compared to her.
I'm gonna make, if I can, make a comment about it. So I'd love, because when we talk about gluttony, all of a sudden we're linking gluttony with food. And
yes.
David's point is gluttony is more than it. What
yes.
about the Donald Trumps of the world who are gluttonous in their consumption and the accumulation of wealth?
Right.
That's the gluttony we should be talking about.
Yes. David, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I do think there is definitely a role for government. I also think that one of the issues we have, and it goes back to that beautiful question earlier, the Industrial Revolution does bring massive changes. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, and this lasted like an awful lot longer in Eastern context than in Western context, the natural order was seen as being in relationship with the divine. It was seen as sacred. It had a mysteriousness that was beyond us. And so this fuels things with a dignity, with a specialness, with a beauty. It's something we try and preserve by things like saying grace. In the modern West, we break that connection between the natural world and the sacred, and it becomes a commodity that we can buy. We can eat wearing baseball hats. We can, because we've paid for it and it's ours, and then we can mine it and utilize it. So there's a whole host of, of cultural and paradigmatical aspects which are impeding us from the kind of eating that I think we're speaking about, where it's a special thing, it's an erotic thing, it's a beautiful thing, and particularly Eastern religions, but native religions and Western religions too, to some extent, have always tried to privilege that, and that's something that I think we've entirely lost in the modern world, and that's part of the social aspect that I think the government can't get at, but the government certainly needs to play a role for sure.
There's a question that somebody wrote in from online and said, speak to the connection between obesity, but I'm going to change that to gluttony. So speak to the connection between gluttony in the industrial world and famine in low-income countries. And with gluttony, often people have to suffer. In this day and age that we have famine, we have incredible amount of famine in this world. So the connection between gluttony and famine, I think it's that's a good question. Who wants to?
Yeah, the entire myth in the West is that resources are not finite. Resources are infinite. This is what drives capitalism, and I think it's fundamentally flawed. I think that resources are finite. Therefore, there's a fundamental reciprocal relationship between overconsumption and underconsumption. We live in a world where our technological resources, which we utilize far beyond in a gluttonous fashion, where they are paid for by unjust wages in the developing world. My daughter was sick a couple of years back, and the machines in hospital that were keeping her alive were made possible by unjust mining practices and unjust labor practices. Our entire lifestyle is predicated upon a gluttonous overconsumption borne on the backs of others. That's the world we live in. And so in order to tackle the issue of gluttony, we can't look at it in isolation in food. We need to look at, I mentioned the other day that our entire social order has a metabolic disorder. It's predicated on overconsumption. Rob's point about Donald Trump is just, he is, irrespective of his BMI, it's nothing got to do with his BMI, he is the glutton par excellence.
How can we have famine? How can we morally have famine in today's world, Michael? How can we just accept that? Because we do accept it in many ways, because by not doing something about it collectively, maybe.
So I can say that the most common coping response is avoidance. And if you get too uncomfortable, then the easiest thing is to distract. And we've already heard that, food is a pretty good distractor. The center of the brain that controls hunger and fullness is that limbic system. So there's a very strong crosstalk between emotions and food and eating. And so for a lot of people, when they have distress, they turn to food, and food becomes a way of numbing or calming. And so this perverse kind of connection that the rich stay heavy and big and consumptive, and we avoid the problem that, because, I'm glad your daughter was treated well.
Yeah.
It's too bad there's these unjust work practices in other parts of the world, but it becomes very challenging for us to really sort of own up to that level of a problem. I think most of us have enough internal problems that we're not quite prepared to manage on our own. We struggle to manage our own distresses, that when we hear about these larger distresses, they become overwhelming for the individual.
And our gluttony is happening too in the industrial world, because I think more and more people are going hungry in the industrial world with the cost. Rob?
Absolutely. Food security, a lack of access to healthy, nutritious food, because it is a huge problem. Many people, many families cannot afford to purchase that healthy food. So what are their choices? Many people have to rely on food banks, which for lots of reasons have calorie dense, more processed foods, or if they have a bit of money, where do they go? It's the cheapest foods are the least healthy foods. So we've got lots of work to do, even within Canada, within Nova Scotia, within Halifax, to address food security, let alone the famine and stuff in other parts of the world.
I think we're going to, would we like to have one more question from the audience? Or is there anybody here who would like to, oh, okay. Where's Lydia? Did Lydia, okay, Lydia, down here at the front.
You hold it? Okay. Now, given that this is a very complex, a problematic topic with, emotional, individual, societal, who has the best position to influence us as a society, and how could this institution, this person, whoever, become effective? How can we actually hear? Why is it that it is so hard to hear the truth about obesity, about gluttony, about the self-abuse that's actually going on? And what can be done about that? Too complex?
I would say all of us. Every single one of us in this room, and every single one of us needs to be aware of this and do something about it. So, yeah, I think we all have a role to play here.
I couldn't agree more. There's lots of policy-based solutions that we could do to make things better. But policy only happens if politicians feel pressure to move in that direction. And believe me, they need a lot of pressure from communities to counter the pressure from the corporate pressure, if you will, that wants to maintain the status quo so they can maximize their profits. So it's incumbent on all. It comes back to our own voices. What choices do we make at the ballot box and as consumers? And what do we do in our communities to help support others who are more or less fortunate than us? It's got to start with us.
I liked your comment because of the implied hopelessness that was sort of underneath that. And I really resonate with that because that's also my sense of what it's like working with individuals living with obesity who are trying to achieve healthier weights and make positive changes, that they feel very much beleaguered. And there's a concept we call learned helplessness. I tried and I failed, tried and I failed, I tried and I failed, I just stopped trying. And that's a very sort of common thing. And so I don't have an answer from a solution point of view, but I would say that working inside this field, that one of the things that I think is really important is to recognize and begin to develop hope in this area. And I really do think there's hope. When I work in my academic work in this field, we're really getting a much better understanding of the neurobiology of behavior, the environmental context of behavior. Just even constructing this panel tonight is, really trying to represent, I think, a strategy that has some potential to lead somewhere. What I would, I think, want to give hope to is to disconnecting your efforts from your weight. That the numbers on the scale are probably the least important outcome And so as part of the Canadian Obesity Network, we don't talk about BMI anymore. We have got something called the Edmonton Obesity Staging System, which is looking at a person's weight in the context of their health. Do you have any health-related problems? Function, what is your functional ability? Are you able to live life the way that you want? And your quality of life. And it only becomes a medical problem when you have a weight that interferes with your health, your function, and or your quality of life. And if we can separate those out, then the hope is to find a behavioral pathway. It is such a dangerous thing to set a goal of weight loss. And I can show you that very quickly by talking about the Biggest Loser series in 2009. So a group of physiologists have been studying the participants in The Biggest Loser who took part in this study in 2009, and they now have data 6 years after the end of the season. From the beginning to the end of the season, over a period of 18 weeks, this group lost as a group 59 kilograms, average weight loss. 6 years later, they have regained 85% of their weight. Now, when you lose weight, your metabolic system changes. Your resting metabolic rate goes down. So you actually get more conservative and more efficient in the processing of your calories. At the beginning of the show, they were, on average, 2,600 calories was their resting metabolic rate. So that's what they would eat, and they would maintain their weight. At the end of the show, that went down to 1,900 calories. 6 years later, their weight has gone back up, 85% regain, and their metabolic rate has gone down another 100 calories. So now these people are, if they eat over 1,700 calories, they will gain more weight. And so it appears as though their metabolic system has been, at least over 6 years, maybe even longer, has been damaged by this attempt to rapidly lose weight. So it looks like it's really problematic to try to maintain. I want to get to this number. I've lost this much weight. I've got to keep going. And part of the challenge that we have, and the hope really, is finding behaviors that improve your health, your function, your quality of life, regardless of what the weight is.
David, maybe I'll get you, everybody else to address that. And I mean, one thing we feel often these days it seems to be is a lack of hope. And so I think that's a really profound question to end on, what you were asking. I mean, I have this little line, you know, keep the faith, it's easily lost. But that's becoming, I say that more and more often these days because of a hopelessness. Can you address that, what she was just talking about, before we do a wrap-up of everybody?
Well, I certainly share a certain level of despair in that our modern global capitalist system requires that we are all like that she-wolf I spoke about earlier, that we are all consumers who will eat in order to try and find the dopamine or whatever we need, or the way we'll scroll through web pages, or the way we'll purchase coffee, or a whole host of things. These are all different manifestations of a fundamental problem. I think that fundamental problem, and this is purely anecdotal, you know, but if I was asked, when have people been least happy in human history, and where? I would say now, in the modern West. You know? So I think what we need is groups of resistance. Groups which rise up to resist the tyranny of the banal, to resist the commodification of the natural order, including food, and intentional communities which say, we're going to live differently. You know, and I think that these kind of communities can be a leaven for bringing about social change. We can definitely help by doing it top down at the government level, policies, etc. But we also need communities which can spring up, which refuse to accept the idea that the natural order is banal, that food is banal, and can work actively to re-enchant these kind of things. And I think this can bring about the kind of ontological change that ultimately I think is necessary.
I think now I'm going to ask for a wrap-up, and we start at this end, so maybe for the beginning, so let's start with Michael and then go down to do a summary of collected thoughts tonight.
Well, I think I've really had the opportunity to say many of the things that I was hoping that I would be able to communicate. I think I'd just really like to note that this is a pretty full audience, so I'd really like to acknowledge that. I think this is a really a timely topic for people And I just hope that we've given you an opportunity to stimulate your thinking a little bit. And I would just want to end on, find something that you can do that enhances your sense of yourself, that gives you meaning and value. And if you follow that path, then I think that's where you'll find that there will be success. And thank you.
Yeah, I also would like to thank everyone for coming. I'm speaking as someone who is very invested in finding ways forward, because I myself am, suffer, the health ill effects from overconsumption of food. And what I think we've heard here tonight is a multifaceted, multi-layered understanding of the problem, which I think can encourage a multifaceted and multi-layered set of solutions. And I think that's the way we need to look at it. We've moved beyond, the first time I went to my doctor as a very large person, she produced this little pamphlet for me, and she gave it to me and said, "There." And in this it was like a sort of pizza, X through it, broccoli, tick, and I was going, thanks, this is great, Later on she said, have you ever tried portion control? Her basic understanding was, you're fat because you're an idiot, Now that was 10 years ago. I think even in these last 10 years, we've moved on significantly. And I think through events like tonight, and great thanks to the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, we can keep moving forward on this topic.
Okay, and my comments are really this, that when we view weight issues as an individual problem and ascribe it to gluttony, which we often do, it doesn't take account of the complexity of the issue. And I think if nothing else, I hope you take away that this is a complex topic. It has arisen from a number of factors, the way we live our lives, how we design our communities, or the money that we even have available for adopting healthy behaviours. From my lens as a health promotion specialist, if we want to improve population health and reduce the burden of chronic diseases, which are costing our healthcare system way too much money, then we need to be thinking about these external factors, and we need to be addressing them. And so thinking about the way that you as an individual can contribute to that conversation, and thinking of ways that you can be an agent of change, I think is really, really important.
So I think I'm going to sum up by, at both, and thanks to everybody who came out tonight and people online as well. But I guess almost a call to action, both at an individual and a collective community level. Let's throw away the scale. Let's forget about weight. Let's focus on creating conditions that allow us to maximize our health. And let's not get paralyzed by the complexity of it. We got to choose. Just start somewhere to make that difference and to move towards health and as we do that individually and collectively, we'll make progress.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give a round of applause to this incredibly thoughtful panel. I'm really honored that I get to be here tonight, and I'm really proud that this organization exists and that we're having this conversation, because really we do need to have more community action and come together as community to answer these profound questions, and in this beautiful library that's creating a place like that. On behalf of CCEPA, we'd like to, and the Segelberg Trust, and the Halifax Central Library, sincere thanks to the panelists that we've just had tonight. We've had Dr. Robert Strang, we've had Dr. Sarah KIRK, get my memory here, we've had Dr. David DEANE and Dr. Michael VALLIS. And we're going to, you can watch the program again if you want to on the CCEPA's YouTube channel, and you can visit the swag table. Sounds kind of gluttonous in Hollywood, but anyways. At the outside room for free copies of programs before, previous programs, and information about the various organizations involved. Now, this is not me asking as a CBC person, but I'm asking on behalf of the organization. This is a really important organization that is bringing public thought to the community and public discourse. If you want to, they ask you, not me, they ask you to consider donating to the center, and you might consider making a donation here tonight. There is a donation jar at the back of the room, at the table, and they don't mind gluttony in this case, with more information about the organization. And the next part, part 4 of the 7 deadly sins is envy, which is a great topic. February 28th, same time, same place. And once again, thank you so much for coming. And I just feel heartened that Halifax has showed up like this. So thank you very much.